Opening hook. What would you do if the world's biggest empire of wealth came knocking at your door? What would you do if they placed $1 billion in front of you and told you, all of this can be yours if you just surrender? Most people would hesitate. Some would accept. But one young African leader stood tall and said no. This is the story of Ibrahim Traoré, and the moment he shook the very foundations of Western power. A story not just about money, but about dignity. Not just about business, but about the soul of Africa. It all began quietly, a high-level meeting. No cameras, no journalists, just suits, papers, and promises. Representatives from Walmart, the largest retail giant in the world, landed in Africa with an offer that seemed impossible to reject. They said, "Mr. President, Walmart admires your courage. We see potential in your nation, and we want to invest. We are prepared to give you $1 billion up front. And in return, we take ownership of the retail industry in Africa. We build the supermarkets, we control the shelves, we decide what Africans buy and from where they buy them." It sounded like a gift, a lifeline. $1 billion. Enough to build roads, schools, and hospitals. Enough to feed millions. Enough to silence critics. But Traoré saw something that most leaders fail to see. Behind the smiles and handshakes, he saw the chains. Because Africa knows this trick too well. For centuries, outsiders have arrived with offers. They brought beads for gold, loans for land, aid for loyalty. And every time, Africa ended up poorer, weaker, and more dependent. Traoré leaned forward. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply said, "Africa is not for sale." The room froze. The delegation didn't expect this. Nobody had ever told them no. Especially not a young soldier, barely in his 30s, leading a country the West often mocks as poor. But Traoré wasn't looking at their billions. He was looking at something bigger. He was looking at the future of every African child. The news spread like wildfire. For the first time, the world had witnessed an African leader refuse a billion-dollar bribe. To many outsiders, it was madness. But to Africans, it was a moment of awakening. On the streets of Ouagadougou, posters appeared with one word: no. Children painted it on walls. Women sang it in markets. Soldiers repeated it like a vow. Because that one word carried the weight of centuries. It wasn't just a rejection of Walmart. It was a rejection of colonial economics. It was a rejection of foreign dominance. It was a rejection of being treated as a continent for sale. But Traoré didn't stop there. Refusing the deal was only the beginning. He asked a question that every African has asked quietly in their hearts. Why do we need them? Why can't we build our own? Why can't Africans open their own supermarkets? Why can't African farmers put their produce directly on African shelves? Why can't African workers be the ones paid instead of corporations billions of miles away? And in that moment, an idea was born. Not Walmart, not Carrefour, not Tesco, but Africa's own retail empire. It started small, a vision scribbled on a piece of paper, shared with ministers, engineers, and workers. Traoré told them, "We will build stores by Africans for Africans. Stores where our farmers supply our food, our designers sell our clothes, our entrepreneurs showcase their products. A supermarket chain that does not bleed Africa, but feeds Africa." The skeptics laughed. The media scoffed. They said, "A tiny country like Burkina Faso cannot compete with Walmart. Africa's too poor, too divided, too corrupt." But what they didn't understand was that this was not about one country. This was about an idea whose time had come. Across villages and cities, the story spread. People whispered about the president who turned down $1 billion. Farmers smiled at the thought of their crops reaching shelves in proud African stores. Youth imagined walking into supermarkets with signs that read, "Not made in China," not imported from France, but proudly African. Mothers imagined buying food grown in African soil, packaged by African hands. Workers imagined jobs where salaries didn't vanish into foreign bank accounts. The people began to dream, and a dream that belongs to millions cannot be stopped. But the West was watching, and they were not amused. For them, Africa is not just a continent, it is a market, a place to dump products, to secure cheap labor, to control supply chains. The idea of Africa owning its own retail empire was more dangerous than any army. So whispers began. Economic threats, political pressure, negative media campaigns. They tried to paint Traore as radical, anti-business, even reckless. But the people didn't care. For the first time in decades, they felt something stronger than fear. They felt pride. And that was only the beginning. Because while the world debated, Ibrahim Traoré had already taken the first step. He launched the first African-owned supermarket, small, humble, but powerful in its symbolism. The shelves were stocked with local goods. The employees were young men and women from nearby villages. And every customer who walked in knew they were not just buying food, they were buying freedom. The story of that first store is where our journey begins. Because that single act of defiance, that single word, no, would spark a revolution across Africa. A revolution that would terrify the West, inspire the people, and prove to the world that Africa is no longer for sale.
Opening hook. They thought he was crazy. They thought no African leader could reject a billion-dollar bribe and survive. But what happened next was something no one expected, because Ibrahim Traoré's no turned into Africa's loudest yes. Yes to freedom. Yes to dignity. Yes to Africa standing tall. The first African-owned supermarket opened its doors in the capital, Ouagadougou. At first, it was small. The shelves were not filled with shiny foreign products. There were no giant banners imported from Europe. No American brands screaming from every corner. Instead, there were baskets of fresh cassava, mangoes, and maize brought directly from local farmers. There were handmade clothes stitched with African fabric. There were soaps, oils, and spices made by small businesses that once sold only in village markets. To outsiders, it looked modest. To Africans, it looked like victory. For the first time, a supermarket in Africa felt truly African. People lined up not just to buy food, but to be part of history. Mothers cried as they walked in with their children. Young men and women took selfies, proudly posting, "This is ours." But victory never comes without enemies. And the West was furious. Reports leaked of boardroom meetings in Paris, Washington, and London. Executives asked the same question: what if this spreads? What if all of Africa follows him? Because if Africans begin controlling their own retail industry, it would mean billions in losses for foreign corporations. No more monopoly on food distribution. No more cheap exploitation of African markets. No more dependence. So the counterattack began. Western media outlets published headlines calling the new supermarkets unsustainable, unrealistic, even dangerous. Anonymous analysts claimed African farmers couldn't supply enough food. Economists warned of inflation. Bloggers mocked the shelves for looking too local. But the truth? The stores were not failing. They were growing. Within months, new branches opened in other towns. Farmers were signing contracts directly with supermarkets, cutting out middlemen who once stole most of their profit. Women entrepreneurs brought in homemade products, jams, shea butter, natural remedies, and watched them sell out in days. For the first time, African labor was being valued on African soil. And as the stores grew, so did the movement. Students volunteered to help design apps for African-owned supply chains. Truck drivers offered their services at lower prices to support the cause. Musicians wrote songs praising Traore and the dream of an Africa that feeds itself. It wasn't just a supermarket anymore. It was a symbol of resistance. But symbols are dangerous to empires. So sabotage followed. Strange power cuts began hitting the supermarkets. Delivery trucks were mysteriously blocked at checkpoints. Fake rumors spread online claiming the stores were selling spoiled food. International banks quietly froze transactions linked to the project. It was clear someone wanted this dream to die before it could spread. And yet, the people refused to give up. Communities stepped in. Farmers donated food for free to keep shelves stocked. Volunteers guarded trucks at night. Local mechanics repaired power generators without charge. It became more than business. It became a battle of will. Traore knew what was at stake. He gathered his ministers and said, "This is not about bread. This is about chains. They want to keep us as customers, never as owners. But if we own our food, we own our future." He announced a bold plan to expand the supermarkets across West Africa, creating a pan-African retail chain. Not French, not American, not Chinese, but African. The reaction was electric. From Dakar to Bamako, from Niamey to Accra, people whispered about the president who turned down $1 billion and built his own supermarkets instead. Crowds marched with banners reading, "Africa is not for sale." Young Africans began imagining something bigger. Not just supermarkets, but African banks, African tech companies, African airlines. If a small country like Burkina Faso could do this, what was stopping the entire continent? But the more the dream spread, the more dangerous it became. Foreign ambassadors warned Traore privately. Some offered partnerships, others threatened consequences. Rumors of assassination plots swirled. And yet, the young soldier president did not flinch. At a rally, standing before tens of thousands, he raised his fist and declared, "They offered us billions to sell our dignity. We refused. They tried to starve our dream. We resisted. And today, we stand together as proof that Africa can rise without permission. This supermarket is not mine. It is yours. It belongs to every African child who deserves a future free from chains." The crowd roared, tears fell, and in that roar, the world heard something terrifying. Africa was no longer silent. By the end of the year, what began as one store in Ouagadougou had become a movement across multiple African nations. Farmers were feeding cities. Youth were running logistics. Families were buying proudly African products. And for the first time in centuries, Africa was not begging for shelves to be filled. It was filling them itself. The story of Ibrahim Traoré rejecting Walmart's billion-dollar bribe was no longer just a story. It was a warning to the West. It was a signal to Africans everywhere. And it was the beginning of something unstoppable. Because once a people learn to say no to exploitation, they learn to say yes to themselves. This is only the beginning. The fire has been lit. The revolution is alive. And Africa's dignity is no longer for sale.